to re-satisfy ourselves with our minds. Ko Davina Hunt tōku ingoa, Mana Ahurea o hei kōpapa Honona Advisory Group. Ka mihi nui kia kōrua te mana o Aukaha, mo te uru mai e tēnei rā. Ōkaha Limited works on behalf of Kāi Tahu to support the aspirations of our 5 local Rūnaka. And it's with great pleasure on behalf of the Hei Kōpapa Honona Advisory Group that I welcome Michael Bathgate and Koraka Edwards, o te whānau o Waitaha Kati Māmoe e Kāi Tahu. If you'd like to join us up here, I really look forward to seeing this presentation because I have heard much of your work and I'm sure there will be many interested parties.
Ai, tēnei te mihi ki a koutou katoa. He mihi ki ngā kai kōrero I tēnei wā mo te kaupapa huringa o Ahuarangi. Nō reira, ko he kororo te mauka ko Aiti te awa ko taki timu te waka. Ko Kāti Huirapa ki Puketeraki taku hapu no Tipoti ahau. I te taha o tōku mama no Liverpool ahau. He kairahi Taiao taku tūraka mahi mo te tari o Aukaha. So kia ora everybody, I'm Korako, I come from Puketeraki Moray in Kāti, and I work for Aukaha as their environmental advisor. And I will just pass over to Michael to introduce himself.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Pakiha ahau, ko no kotorana oku tupuna, I whānau mai au I Pakatane, engari I tipuaki au I Ōtākou, me I Homoru hoki, no Ōtākou ahau, he kai whakamaheri heri I Aukaha, ko Michael Bathgate tōku ingoa. So yeah, Michael Bathgate, I'm a senior planner at Aukaha. That's all. And oh, sorry, I would also like to introduce supporting us here today is Paul Blask from the Nuau project, which is Marsden Fund project that you'll be hearing about at the end of our presentation. So yeah, tēnā koutou katoa.
So yeah, just a bit of an overview for our presentation. We're going to be talking, I'll be talking a little bit more about Aukaha and what we do. And I will also be, we'll also be talking about what mahi and the climate change space has already been undertaken and think projects that are ongoing. I will talk a little bit about the challenges that Aukaha faces, the representation of Kā Rūnaka and Ōtākou, and also talking about future mahi as well. So this is a bit of a kiwaha which talks behind the name that we now use as Aukaha. Aukaha, as was mentioned before, represent the mana and rakatīrataka of the 5 Rūnaka based on Ōtākou. So we have Te Rūnanga o Waihao, just north of the Waitaki River, Te Rūnanga o Moeraki, Kāti Huirapa ki Puketeraki in Kāti, Ōtākou Rūnaka, and Hokonui in Gore. And then the takiwā of those 5 Rūnaka extends inland to the Upper Lakes area in the Hollyford Valley. So as you can see, it's quite a large area of land to be overseeing. And just an important point to make is that while Aukaha are kind of the doers and the hands and arms of the Rūnaka, the mana and the sort of authority to make the decisions over the landscape remains with Aukaha, with the mana whenua. So yeah, as I was saying, we're the vehicle, but not the sort of decision makers. So there are 4 pou which make up the Aukaha team. So Mana Aukaha are the sort of people and culture and the glue and helps run the day-to-day and keep us all organised. Mana Takata was formerly known as our Health and Social Services team. So sort of their overall objective is to work towards achieving equity in employment, health and education for Māori within Ōtākou. So that includes projects like supporting whānau into employment, and tailoring culturally appropriate pastoral and support for rakatahi who may be moving into, employment and into their careers. Another example of a project that Mana Takata support as project managers for Whiri o Te Waitaki is a project with Moeraki Rūnaka, restoring 2 of their sites of cultural significance on the Waitaki River. So just helping with some of that oversight and connecting our whānau to funding, as well as another project that's worked on out of the Mana Takata team is the allocating funds of healthy homes, which has included projects on the Ōtākou Peninsula and in Karitani now. And then we also have the Mana Ahurea team, or cultural and economic development. So they're all about creating leadership opportunities for mana whenua and increasing the sort of presence of mana whenua visibility through regional development. So yeah, all about embedding those into projects, design and strategy and plans, working alongside councils and other organisations. And so some of the examples of the Mana Ahurea work program include the supporting the Dunedin Hospital rebuild, George Street redevelopment, infrastructure developments in Queenstown, as well as have done some work facilitating cultural workshops with organisations who've looked for that kind of support. But Michael and I here today are representing the Mana Taiao team. So this slide represents some of the areas of work that we get engaged with. So the Mana Taiao team comprises mostly, we have the largest cohort of planners, and we also have a consent processing team, and then 1 environmental scientist ecologist, which is me. And yeah, so some of the bits of work that we focus on is being that liaison or conduit point between organisations and consultants and regional councils with mana whenua. I think probably before the existence of Kāi Tahu ki Ōtākou, as Ōtākou is formerly known, there was just inundation of requests coming directly through to Rūnaka, and not really much of an ability to handle all of those requests or the technical expertise. So that's part of the reason how Aukaha came to be. We also have been doing, or do a lot of work with policy development. So in putting that mana whenua presence and sort of perspective into policy direction. So that's included the regional policy statement, the land and water plan, territorial plans, helping develop the Kāi Tahu perspective on Te Mana o Te Wai with the national policy statement. And another big part of our work program is the importing into the resource consent process. So that's where a request will come in for some sort of resource consent, and our team will try and boil down the information and the key points and do an assessment of what the potential impacts might be on cultural values. For example, looking at statutory acknowledgement areas or impacts on water, mahika kai species, and these sorts of things. As well as preparing cultural impact assessments and cultural value statements for projects. So looking, that would be the next layer after the resource consent process, is digging a bit deeper and seeing what the impacts of a potential project might be on mana whenua values in a particular area. And then we're also involved in a range of other forums, such as like Jobs for Nature, Ōtākou Biodiversity Forum, and having some input now into some of the council programs that are coming up for ecosystem threats. So hopefully that just gives a little bit of that's just some of the work we do, but yeah, we're quite a busy team as well as for the Rūnaka. I'm now going to pass over to Michael to talk a bit about, just kidding. So yeah, these are just some of the main focus areas for us at the moment. With freshwater work is big with the reforms in that space. Waihi tupuna mapping and putting those down so that the rest of the public can understand what the importance of those features and landscapes are for mana whenua. Coastal environment, tauka, mahika kai species is sort of interweaves with a lot of those different areas there. And then as we've also got air and atmosphere as a key topic as well. So yeah, Michael's just going to talk a little bit about mahi today.
Yeah, thanks. One thing that I noticed about that Mana Ahurea slide is it didn't have climate change mahi on there. So, I think that's one of the great ironies of our age is we, like everyone else, we've got so much going on that climate change is the poor cousin to our day-to-day work. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of people in the room. So, yeah, but climate change is certainly first and foremost in our mind. Just getting it into the work programs can be the really tricky bit. So I'm just going to run through a little bit in terms of our sort of engagement in climate change related mahi to date, our engagement on behalf of Rūnaka. I've just gone down to the end of the slide. Sorry about that. There you go. Arrow's not page down. It was a sneak preview of the rest of the presentation. So yeah, as I think Sean mentioned in his presentation this morning, Ōtākou does have an overarching climate strategy, Te Tahu o Te Whāriki, which was pulled together in 2018. And I'm not sure, I think it was one of the early iwi climate change strategies. And it really does provide quite an overarching framework at an iwi-wide level as to how Ōtākou will respond to climate change, but also hoping to meet aspirations of hapu and whānau at the sort of Rūnanga and level. So the strategy itself follows the same structure as the tribal strategic direction, which provides direction and priority focus areas across 9 different areas. I won't run through these all, but these sort of give an idea, I guess, of the reach of climate change throughout, day-to-day business of an organisation, an entity, a structure, an iwi, such as Ōtākou. So to Aotearoa, which is our main area of focus, the natural environment is just sort of one of those 9 po. But obviously, having said that, it also reaches across a lot of the other ones, culture and identity, for instance. Mahinga Kai or Mahika Kai, as it's called down here, is regarded as sort of cornerstone of Ngāi Tahu culture, because the iwi are historically such a nomadic people following Mahika Kai resources around the motu. So culture and identity becomes a huge part of climate change, and also just overlaps so much with natural environment. So other mahi that's sort of gone on in the past, it was interesting hearing from Emily this morning in terms of what Niwa are up to now with the flood work. Niwa were commissioned by Ngāi Tahu to do sort of takiwā-wide climate modelling back in 2017 to provide projections across the takiwā for Ngāi Tahu in terms of real focus on temperature, rainfall, and extreme rain event projections or predictions. Also looking at things like evapotranspiration rates, if I'm getting that terminology correct, what that might mean for the whenua, I guess, and sort of associated resources. As part of that work, they also did supplementary reports at a Moray level. Sometimes the data didn't necessarily lend itself to that level of granularity, if you like, so it might have used regional level data instead. So that's a sort of useful resource for the Rūnaka in terms of what rainfall may look like moving forward, what temperature may look like moving forward in their local areas. Another piece of work that was done around the same time as the Ngāi Tahu strategy was being pulled together was this report, Kāi Tahu o Te Rangi, which was compiled in 2017, and that was Te Rūnanga o Ngāi Tahu, along with some local researchers, trying to do a bit of a SWOT analysis at Rūnanga level as to what climate change meant for people, the issues that they saw approaching with climate change, the particular threats, and just, I guess, a bit of a first cut at what adaptation to that might look like. So as part of that, there were hui at Ōtākou Moray and at Puketeraki Moray. One of the key issues involved, which we'll probably hear us bang on a bit about in this presentation, but one of the key issues for Rūnaka that they identified was actually, and they saw back then, and it's played out to date, is actually sustaining ongoing involvement in climate change related mahi, just the challenge at Rūnaka level, and I guess understanding climate change for a start, but also how, and then understanding what it meant for Rūnaka, and then, yeah, how to sort of deal with it, I guess. There are a number of other issues that were identified that you'd expect, flooding related, the sort of viability of living in areas that are prone to coastal erosion. Most but not all of the Rūnaka we deal with are coastal, so they're very susceptible to the predicted changes. If they're not coastal, they're associated closely with awa, with rivers, and so they're going to be subject to change as well. And then just things like urupa cemeteries. We do have instances where they are susceptible to coastal erosion as well, and then just other tanga sites as well. So following on from that, and following the National Climate Change Risk Assessment that, again, Sean Awatiri talked about in his presentation, the Regional Council here commissioned a Regional Climate Change Risk Assessment, which kicked off, I'm not exactly sure, it predated my time, but around 2019, I think, or early 2020, which followed the National Climate Change Risk Assessment methodology in terms of grouping climate change risks into 5 different domains: natural environment, human, economy, built environment. I've only got 4 there, haven't I? And governance, I think, was the last domain. So the ORC, so Tonkin and Taylor compiled that report. The ORC invited Rūnaka, I believe, to be involved with that, but there just wasn't capacity around the same time that bulk of that mahi was being done. But we did get to input into the process on behalf of Rūnaka sort of further on in that project. Some of the limitations, a lot of that input was by way of expressing some perceived limitations in terms of the approach from a Tāo Māori perspective, and sort of identifying areas of work sort of moving forward. And a lot of those sort of limitations that were expressed by local Rūnaka sort of mirrored what was identified in the national report as well, in terms of things like having quite a reductive approach, which is sort of at odds of a sort of a more integrated or holistic way of looking at things. And so I was really interested to see the Manaaki Whenua approach, which sort of, by necessity, I guess, again, had to split risk or issue identification into different topic areas, but these, to me anyway, at first glance, seem a lot more aligned to a Māori perspective on how you might conduct that type of issue identification. Another thing was that just the interdependencies and the related issue, the interdependencies of those risks, what climate change risk in one area, be it heavy rain events, might mean in another area, be it effects on mahikakai gathering activities or just the mode of different waterways might be. So again, a bit of an issue with taking quite a reductive approach to risk identification. We sort of highlighted a number of Kāi Tahu values and issues that we didn't think were well integrated into the risk assessment, and so that's obviously work on areas for this type of work. And just lastly, that ORC did, as I say, there was limitations on our ability to input into the process. This was acknowledged by ORC and by Tonkin and Taylor when the report was pulled together, and it was acknowledged that this work sort of needs to carry on. And then I just thought I'd throw in a quote here from Lynn Carter, who is from Puketeraki Rūnaka, who was going to be presenting this presentation today. So Lynn couldn't make it, and so Kurako and I are filling in, if you like. In addition to impacts on mahi kai and the mobility of water, climate change might impact on other resources significant to Kāi Tahu, such as tapu sites, wāhi tūpuna, tauka species and habitats, and coastal environment in general. Kāi Tahu are connected to all of these elements through whakapapa, kaitiaki and associated tikaka, which govern how kaitiaki is exercised. Any diminishment of the mobility of these elements through impacts of climate change is felt as a diminishment of the mana of Kāi Tahu mana whenua. So this sort of gives you an idea, I guess, from a Kāi Tahu perspective. It's not just about this is an impact on a particular species or habitat or ecosystem. It's how it links back through to the mana of the people that are kaitiaki of those resources, impacts on how sort of cultural knowledge is imparted, which is closely tied to tikanga, to mahi kai activities, and to reo, to language itself. How these things are passed on through generations can be affected by extreme climatic and other ecological change. So it's, from the Kāi Tahu perspective, it's not just this is an environmental issue. You know, it flows through the whole culture. And I guess another thing that we probably didn't quite mention at the start of the presentation is that we're coming at it from an environmental view. When I put up that slide of the Kāi Tahu climate change strategy, it spans so many different areas of health and well-being of people, education, of jobs, you know. So our presentation is really about the environmental aspects and how Rūnaka might deal with those, but they are sort of interrelated to those much broader aspects of life. Is that me?
All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that Aukaha face in responding to climate change, as well as what would be faced for Rūnaka in response. So yeah, as Michael said, we've said a few times, capacity is a real challenge for us. So this is a little quote that had come through from one of our Rūnaka at the top there. So just to drill into that a little bit deeper, it's, you know, sometimes when we're putting these requests out for various, you know, things that are looking for engagement from mana whenua, it wouldn't be uncommon to see a whānau member replying to an email at maybe 9 or 10 o'clock at night after they've done kind of a full day's worth of work and maybe responded to other committees and sort of things that they are involved with. So we kind of probably at the best we'd be looking at maybe like 12 or 15 Rūnaka members who are quite well engaged on, depending on what the kaupapa is, and will respond to requests. So it's yeah, an ongoing challenge, but you know, there's we're seeing some improvement in you know, engagement from organisations and becoming partners on projects, which is sort of helping go in the right direction to build that capacity. And another thing to just be aware of is that traditionally a lot of the involvement that mana whenua have in different committees or projects has been on a mahi aroha or voluntary basis. So it's not uncommon that a lot of that work is done for aroha, which is part of the Māori culture, I think, is to do mahi whāroha on behalf of your Rūnaka, but just sort of adds to that historical kind of pattern of hard to get, difficulty in getting engagement when people have to, you know, go to work and still do their 9 to 5 jobs. The other point at the bottom here as well is just about the lack of specialist personnel. So another thing Michael and I probably should say is that neither of us have any specialty expertise in climate change. So we're responding to you know, the requests and projects that are coming to Aukaha, but it's really something that needs to sort of grow for ourselves in Aukaha, but as well on the mana whenua side, you know, that we're trying to translate this information to them without having any specialty expertise on their side as well. So I suppose, and to that point, something that I would offer to anybody who's listening to this who might be a researcher or one day goes on to work for some organization who wants to engage is to just, when you're applying for that funding, just put in that little budget line about mana whenua engagement, and whether that be having someone who can go and work on the mana whenua side and be that inside person for you to help liaise, or whether that's just some funding to help, you know, do a wānanga. That's stuff that would be really helpful to us, and I think for mana whenua. Yeah, and so following on from that, specialty personnel, just the difficulties we see in translating this quite complex information that can be sometimes very data heavy and difficult to convey. So I suppose anyone who's had to present climate change in a public forum might appreciate that point. So but we do see that there are some, you know, there are new tools now which can help with this, such as like GIS and story maps and different ways of presenting information that might make it easier for, in say a marae setting, to convey those messages. Also, the difficulty of framing things in a mātauraka Māori or a te ao Māori way is something that can be a challenge, putting it into terms that make sense to whānau on the ground, or kind of, you know, with climate change, a lot of the sort of predictions sit out here, so it can be difficult for whānau to see what those impacts might look like on the ground. Another area that can be quite tricky is incorporating that mātauraka Māori. You know, there's a lot of organisations now that are keen to tap into that knowledge basket, which is really, really awesome to see, but it's just that understanding, well, firstly, that that mātauraka Māori that you might want to tap into may only be with a few small individuals, like I was talking about with that capacity issue, who have that mātauraka Māori that people would want to tap into, or it's in hidden places and is required to be, you know, revitalized. So then it's come back to that capacity issue where you're going to the same people again and again to try and get that mātauraka. And then also just the sensitivity around the information sometimes, I think have been touched on, that some of the information is not always, it's something that just wants to stay within the whānau and is not always something that might want to be published or widely for everyone to know. But I suppose yeah, and the last point I just had there about mātauraka Māori is that it's, you know, the challenges that we're facing with climate change are new for everyone, and finding the ways to tap into the mātauraka Māori knowledge base and figuring out how to apply it to climate change is an evolving process. And then just a little bit about the challenges we face with the Western planning approach. So we've heard today about the managed retreat, and there's difficulties for whānau because of where those marae are located, have a strong connection to the whenua with wāhi tūpuna, or if you have urupā or marae, that's where the connections and have been built, or it has that, yeah, through whakapapa as well, through that genealogy to that area. So so for whānau, it's not quite as simple as just moving your home, because there's those other reasons why the community or the whānau is based around that area. And so one of the examples of that, I'm not sure how clear it is, but this is a picture of Kāti Huirapa Rūnaka on the west coast. So this is their marae and this is the ocean. So they are currently having to essentially look at where they are to shift their marae, which can be quite a painful process. Also, if you've got urupā there and having to uplift your mate and the people who've passed and move that is yeah, quite a challenging thing to do. Another thing with Western planning approaches, or potential risk, is about how new infrastructure might block that connection with the environment. So, you know, for an engineer to come along and say, well, we want to put a seawall here because that's the easiest solution, that's going to protect these properties, that's very good and well, and we want to see that, you know, properties and land are protected, but that might also come with affecting the ability for, say, a whānau to get down to the coast and collect the Mehika Kai and continue that practice and pass that on. So just having to try and look at the solutions that are being developed and make sure that the values for Māori are also being considered in how that solution is developed. And the final point I had there was just about papakaika based away from infrastructure supply. So as we know, all of the Marae and the Ōtākou Takiwā are based rurally. So we're just seeing a potential with the Western planning approach that if those communities were to be moved, it's likely that, you know, regional authorities would want those communities to move closer to where existing infrastructure is, which, as I had discussed previously, the area where the marae is located might not, you know, is there for specific reasons. And yeah, my final point is just about, being a part of adaptation in terms of challenges. So it's, with the capacity issues, it's really important that mana whenua are involved in the issues identification process, because you know, once the adaptation phase comes into things, it's difficult if that Māori worldview hasn't been captured at that issues identification phase. So the other, we've also got the sort of putting a te ao Māori lens across the, excuse me, putting a te ao Māori lens across the issues that are being addressed here, which we've talked about a bit. Mana whenua projects, plans and strategies, some of the past work have been developed and are in place, but haven't always looked at climate change. So that's, you know, a lot of those plans are going to have to be brought up again and looked at how climate change sits across a lot of that work, which is going to require, you know, time and resource and those specialty skills that we talked about. And then my final point was just about involving the rakatahi, you know, sort of view on all of this, because I think from our from a Māori perspective, you know, we're in the phase where we're developing these solutions and planning for how we're going to adapt. But, you know, it'll be rakatahi who have to take over those, you know, those plans and models that have been put in place and really like kind of champion and take ownership of those plans. So it's really important for us that we try and bring the rakatahi voice to the table so that they're on board when we get into that implementation part of addressing climate change.
So I'm just going to round out our presentation by talking about where we're going moving forward with our climate change mahi. So first, a big shout out to the good folk of Haukapapa Hononga. We've had a lot of support in terms of the work that we've been trying to do or trying to get underway. So I think I talked about the ORC climate change risk assessment process and how we identified that there was a need for a bit more of a Kāi Tahu lens about the way that was done. So we've had a couple of small projects that we've been running with Haukapapa Hononga. One is a literature review that was done by an intern last summer, Ella Aitchison, who was a humanities intern who was going on to actually do climate change adaptation from an Indigenous perspective as her master's thesis. So she pulled together a bit of a literature review on Indigenous methodologies toward understanding climate change issues and identified some common factors for Indigenous toolkits to deal with climate change. And these are around things about sort of being created by the Indigenous communities that are going to end up using it, being adaptable, being customised to specific issues, being diverse, and being created by Indigenous people with Indigenous knowledge. So some good findings out of that, and that was being picked up and brought into a project that was looking at a toolkit for Rūnaka in terms of how they might identify climate change issues at a Rūnaka level. A big driver for this process is not wanting to be left behind on the adaptation train for us. So if all this work's been done on risk assessment, but Rūnaka and Moray have been left behind when the funding starts coming and the project development starts coming in on the adaptation side of things. If we're left behind, yeah, it's not going to be good in terms of being part of the adaptation process. So there's been work underway. Lynn Carter has been sort of working on what climate change toolkits might look at Rūnaka level. I think we need to step back also and look at the Manaaki whenua work and how that might inform that work as well. I think where Lynn was arriving at was that it needed to be a whakapapa-centred approach to issue identification. And by that I think she means the way that effectively that the tangata connect to the whenua, which is through their whakapapa affiliations with wāhi tūpuna, with different areas and different resources. So some of the other projects that are sort of going on the sort of issue identification side of things, we're doing a bit of work with a student from the University Business School over the summer, who's going to be looking at available data on relating to climate change, that particularly relating to the Rūnaka, and I guess how you visualise this data in terms of what it means on the ground for people, for resources, and for different areas. We'll see how far we can get in the summer. It's just an internship for this poor young fella. So, you know, he might only get to the stage of pulling together what the relevant data is and how we clean it, and then we might have to pick it up and do the sort of translation side of it. But this is part of the process, if you like, of what Korako alluded to earlier in terms of the complexity of climate change data and making it understandable in terms of what it means for people, for lay people in general. Another project that's had Manatū Taonga, Ministry of Culture and Heritage seed funding, is undertaking a coastal archaeological inventory project with a focus on, I guess, wāhi tūpuna and Māori archaeological sites. So the scope, as I understand it, the seed funding was just to scope the project, and we've got to go back to Ministry for Culture and Heritage to put in a further funding application for that. But again, in terms of issue identification, that's much needed work. Nuwau, I won't say too much about now. I don't want to steal Paul's thunder. So that's another project that, while it's centred around adaptation, to my understanding of it, issue identification is a necessary part of that project as well. That's a little bit of that is sort of the key projects, if you like, that we're involved with in terms of issue identification. There are other climate change projects that are sort of going on that we are either involved with or in the process of possibly becoming involved with as well. So there's a lot going on in the space. In terms of adaptation, one of the things to come out of the Kāi Tahu climate change strategy was the need for Moray-centred climate change strategies. I think it had a deadline of 2025 for those to be in place. For a variety of reasons, COVID comes out again, COVID being one of them. I guess the implementation of that Kāi Tahu strategy is probably not as far advanced as it could be, but this is certainly one of the things that needs to come out of that is what does adaptation look like at a more localised Moray level. The other thing that we're sort of mindful of is that, as I just mentioned before, the adaptation train is going to be leaving the station pretty soon on behalf of councils or central government, and we need to sort of be part of that conversation, even if we don't have the full range of issues identified and sized yet. We still need to be part of those early conversations about what adaptation looks like. In terms of other things going on, future development strategies are a piece of work that councils are required to undertake, Tier 1 and Tier 2 councils, which is the larger ones, as part of the National Policy Statement for Urban Development Capacity. So Dunedin City Council, for instance, is going to be initiating work on that next year. While the focus of those is really on urban areas, and Moray are on peri-urban or rural areas, it's important that we're part of those conversations as well. It's difficult because, and Korako alluded to this earlier as well, these are areas that generally aren't serviced for infrastructure. There's going to be a lot of pressure for moving to areas that are, I guess, but there are the connection to those areas, you know, to the whenua there. So I guess it's a case of how do you manage, say, managed retreat within those broader areas if it's necessary, from coastal areas, say, uphill slightly, where the planning provisions don't at all provide for that process. So that's something that we'll be grappling with that. Another thing we need to look at in terms of adaptation is our Ewe Management Plan, Kāi Tahu ki Ōtākou Natural Resource Management Plan. The current one dates from 2005. Not particularly vocal on climate change at the time. Iwi management plans are hopefully going to take more of a central role with the RMA reform. At the moment, councils and consent applicants and the like just have to take them into account. Hopefully they're going to have a more of a central stage when the RMA reforms come through. But as part of that challenge, we need to get the current Iwi management plan probably up to date in respect of areas such as climate change, if not a complete overhaul, which is a massive amount of work, and one that's sort of quite daunting and scary for us, but it probably does need to happen. The other thing that a couple of presenters have mentioned today as well is that the coming Climate Change Adaptation Act, which is sort of part of the RMA reform, it's sort of lagging behind the other two key pieces of legislation. And my understanding is that it hasn't really been scoped or any date for it, for any early releases of it identified yet, but it really will have a focus around managed retreat. Really will be one of the core aspects of that piece of legislation. And lastly, in terms of adaptation, Nuau project as well offers a sort of vehicle for identifying strategies for our local Rūnanga, and Paul is going to be presenting a few slides on that. So I'll just leave you with that, with this Kāi Tahu whakatauki, I guess you could call it, mō tātou a mō ka uri a muri ake nei, for us and for those that follow us, for the children that follow us. So I think probably leave questions to after Paul's done his slides. Yeah, kia ora. Yeah,
thanks, Michael. Tēnā koutou katoa, ki te iwi kāinga, he mihi nui ki a koutou. Kei whanganui a tāra, toku kāinga, kei ko Paul Blaschke toku ingoa. So I'm Paul Blaschke, and I'm a researcher based at Te Heranga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Thanks very much for the opportunity to sort of add to what Michael and Korako have told you about the large mahi being undertaken here, and thanks to the organisers of the symposium for allowing me into this symposium. So I'd also like to bring you greetings from Maybrit Peterson-Zari, the project leader of our this Nuau project, who sadly couldn't be here today, but sends her greetings to you. So this unwieldy title, which we've tried to give a slightly interesting acronym to, Nature-Based Urban Design for Wellbeing and Adaptation in Oceania. And that's what I'll give a very brief, and I hope not too simplistic, outline of what we're on about and how we'd like it perhaps to be part of this huge Kāi Tahu and Ōtākou response. So we've just got snapshots of our team. It's quite multidisciplinary and quite multicultural in its makeup. And we're based at, as I said, Te Heranga Waka, mainly in the architecture school, and I will explain that in a few minutes. So just to give a little bit of a background to what we're doing, the pressures of climate change, but also the pressures of rapid urbanisation, which we haven't talked about so much, but particularly in some of our Pacific neighbours, but also in many parts of Aotearoa. They're both there, and they're operating in sync with each other to some extent. We have heard a lot about how those pressures are detrimental to both to ecosystems and to human well-being. And there are many inequalities in the vulnerabilities of different people to those impacts. We don't need to stress how urgently these pressures need to be addressed. So this research co-designs, together with communities, urban design strategies that are centred in Indigenous ecological knowledge, or matauranga, and nature-based solutions as a means to adapt to climate change and urbanisation impacts. Many of you will know something about nature-based solutions. The simplest definition and introduction I can give to those of you who don't. Nature-based solutions aim to increase human well-being and resilience by working with, conserving and restoring nature, rather than trying to sort of impose other solutions, particularly technical or engineered solutions, upon nature. So as summarised in the right-hand part of the slide, there are many different approaches, skills, sources and scales of operation around the NBS concept, and they can be applied to those societal challenges to increase human well-being and also bring biodiversity and ecosystem benefits. I think it's worthwhile just drilling down for a moment into our working model of what we're trying to achieve in this project. So starting at the left, I've referred to these climate change pressures, these urbanisation pressures, often operating in sync to some extent. Reducing the health of ecosystems and people. So in the centre is the sort of the engine room of what we're trying to do. We're trying to take an ecosystem-based approach that is at the hub of nature-based solutions. What we're also trying to do is operate within a framework of human well-being. And that framework of human well-being, and also applying what Indigenous people have already worked out about their ecosystems and the necessity to adapt to those ecosystems. That traditional knowledge, as it's known internationally, or matauranga as we would know it here in Aotearoa, they're really part of the cornerstone of our approach, and the area where we think we can perhaps make a bit of a difference to some of the international approaches to nature-based solutions. And the outcomes then, we hope, will be those more resilient and healthy urban environments. And I have only used the word urban just now because we are looking predominantly at urban systems, although we're taking quite a broad view of urban systems. We've heard mentions of peri-urban, and certainly peri-urban areas that interface between the central city and the rural areas. They're really very important sort of driving areas for what goes on in urban systems. So if our NBS in that framework can deliver more healthy and resilient urban environments that will increase the human well-being, reduce those negative impacts, and also reduce the impacts of climate change and the negative impacts of urbanisation. So in summary of how I've sort of introduced this, the overall aim of our New Wow project is to develop nature-based urban design solutions rooted in Indigenous programs, Indigenous knowledges that support climate change adaptation and individual and community well-being in different contexts across Aotearoa and Oceania. So we see Aotearoa as part of Oceania. And just to emphasise again that urban design solutions phrase, and for that reason, this project is centred in the School of Architecture at Victoria University. So to derive much of the community-based knowledge for this project and for the outputs of the project, we're working with 5 urban communities right around Oceania to develop these nature-based solutions and achieve those desired outcomes that I've just mentioned. So starting from north to south, way up in South Tarawa in Kiribati, in Micronesia, a very small country, but in fact, South Tarawa is experiencing one of the highest rates of urbanisation and one of the densest populations in the world, despite being one of the most vulnerable communities you can possibly imagine to the effects of global climate change. Then in Polynesia, Apia in Samoa, in Melanesia, Port Vila, the capital of Vanuatu, and then here in Aotearoa, where we're working in Te Awa Kairangi or Noa Hut, close to where I live. And we very much hope, we're just in the early stages of discussion with through Aukaha, as Michael and Korako have described, here in Otipoti. So just giving you some idea of how we hope that Nuau could be useful, make a difference for Rūnaka responses to climate change here in coastal Ōtākou. So we would like to work alongside Moray and communities to devise nature-based climate change adaptation plans, strategies and designs. You know, there are a number of different outputs and I don't want to foreshadow what they will be. The Kāi Tahu climate change strategy has been referred to a couple of times and I think that is a very important guiding document, but bearing in mind that a key idea in that strategy was the knowledge that it was a high-level guide and that everywhere local marae, local communities had to be make it work for them at their local level with the knowledge of their place. Then, firstly, to understand how that people in that local place know and are part of their local natural ecosystems. So it's only when we've got that understanding that we can work with those communities with our design-based approaches to build all kinds of infrastructure and assets, if you like, whether they be buildings, marae, complexes, neighbourhoods, towns, and the urban and blue and green spaces, to develop these nature-based adaptations to climate change impacts. A method to develop those designs might be co-design workshops to develop those approaches and the follow-up discussions. And as I've tried to emphasise, the reporting and follow-up, we haven't been specific about what form they'll take. Some of the forms have already been mentioned as examples, but basically what the Rūnaka want and need in relation to adapting to climate change. And to all of this, I want to put the proviso that they're subject to the provisos that have been mentioned, particularly by Korako and Michael just now, but also during the day, the capacity, the demand, all limit what the Rūnaka themselves can provide. Also the sensitivity, we don't want to be seen as miners of that matauranga to take away, let alone to appropriate it. We have to work out the right protocols to work with the cooperation. Also bearing in mind only some of our team members are Māori or Pacifica for our Oceania case studies. So it is early days, but that's how we hope that could work. I just want to mention that we have a wonderful kāhui or advisory plan to guide us and help us in this process. We see them as operating as conduits, collaborators, and our conscience in the process. And they also add a lot to the diversity of our group. And especially to mention the support, the huge support we've already received from Dr. Lynn Carter, whose name's come up a few times today. And that's been tremendous in making the contacts here. And we all wish, I'm sure, Lynn all the best and hope that she's back with us very soon. And finally, I think I don't want to cut short the discussion, so there's a timeline there. We've got about another 2.5 years to go through the process and get some really impactful outcomes in the form of design guides, competitions, as well as the more traditional research reports and publications, etc. And just acknowledging that we have received significant support from the Marsden Fund and Royal Society Te Aparangi and some contact